So we're here at the Dartmouth Heritage Museum in the Evergreen House and I'm just going to guess, I'm going to use my psychic powers here, Dartmouth, Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
And this is exciting for me because this is the city I grew up in. And when I was a kid, they would trundle us off every year in elementary school to visit the Dartmouth Heritage Museum down by the...
Up on Wise Road.
Right, by the old bridge.
Yeah.
So tell me a bit about that museum and how it transitioned and why it transitioned to here at the Evergreen House and also some of the other properties that are part of the museum system.
So the museum, it formed in 1961. Now, they didn't have an actual physical museum. It wasn't until the Centennial Project in 1967, and they got the old City Hall, which was the building on Wise Road.
Ah, so it was a Centennial Project.
Yep.
Ah,
yeah.
They were dropping them, like if you go to Alberta, in St. Paul, Alberta, they have a flying saucer pad, which was their Centennial Project. And so I remember interviewing them. I was filming a documentary years ago about cattle mutilations of all things. And I interviewed the town mayor and I said, what about St. Paul, Alberta possessed you to build a flying saucer pad? Because the town has nothing to do. You have no UFO landings or any stories of that. And he said, no. It just, they were giving free money to everybody. And we thought this would be a great tourist attraction because flying saucers were a big thing then. I said, great. So there's a giant pierogi somewhere in some town nearby. So for Dartmouth, it was the museum.
It was that. But even before that, Evergreen and Quaker House were part of the Dartmouth Museum. This house was the house of Helen Creighton and the Creighton family. And this property was originally, the first European that settled on this property was a Creighton.
So how did it wind up going from Wise Road to here?
So in 1996, with amalgamation, there's a whole different scenario. It wasn't the community museum run by the Dartmouth Heritage Museum. The Dartmouth Heritage, that community museum was actually owned by, it was a part of the Dartmouth government. And similarly, Scott Manor House in Bedford was a museum owned by the community and part of the government. So we were part of, we had a government, so they had to do something. Well, what do? Halifax has never had its own museum. They always relied on the Nova Scotia Museum. And in terms of archives, they always depended on the Nova Scotia Archives.
Right.
And they had all these collections, and they had the building up there, and they had these two buildings, Evergreen House and Quaker. So what do they do with all of this? Then, of course, Wise Road, there was a problem with contamination. It was asbestos and lead and everything that is nasty about older buildings. So what they had to do is they had to move everything out. So they moved everything to a warehouse in Burnside and to all of the collections because they had to do something with the collections to keep it safe. So they moved it. And so this became the administrative headquarters of the museum.
Tell me a bit about the house itself, because it's a piece of history. Give me the sort of 411 on its backstory, starting with the Creightons, I guess, and then working through leaving the Creightons and then coming back to the Creightons and how Helen Creighton eventually wound up here and why it's so tied into her story.
Early 1919, early 1920, one of the Creightons bought the property back. So they had owned it back in the 1760s, sold it in the 1860s, bought it back in the 1920s, 1919-ish. That Creighton sold it to Helen's parents. And so Helen came here as a young woman. She was 20 years old.
I think most people in Nova Scotia, at least if you're from here, would know the name Helen Creighton, even if they might not necessarily know who she was or what she did. The name would be familiar. For the people that would know more than that and would actually have an idea of what she did, I think most people, if you were to ask them on the sidewalk, hey, Helen Creighton, do you know who she was? Yes, what'd she do? Blue Nose Ghosts. That's the book you'll see in the airports and all the bookshops and everything. But she did a lot more than just collect ghost stories and paranormal stories. Tell me a bit about Helen Creighton, why she's so important to the preservation of Nova Scotian history in a way that maybe folks wouldn't expect if all that they knew was her collection of ghost stories and things like that.
She publishes her first book in the early 1930s, but she starts collecting folklore in 1928. And she starts in places like Devil's Island and Hartland Point, out that way. And then she moves around the province. And she's collecting these things called child ballads, particularly. But there's so much else out there. There's the fishermen's songs. There's a lot of material out there. And it wasn't until much later in the 40s, early 50s, she takes courses on folklore. And somebody asks her, oh, well, there's a large black population up there. Have you interviewed any of them? Oh, well, she had never done. And I guess it never had occurred to her maybe. But then she starts. And then she starts with the Mi'kmaq. She starts recording everybody. She's picked up, by this time, they've picked up so many stories. She actually traveled the province in the 40s and 50s, and she didn't have, at that time, the really early stuff, she wouldn't even have a recorder. She had this thing, we have it upstairs, called a melodeon. And this melodeon, it's like a little keyboard, and you pump the handle, and then you go, and it will play the notes. So you're blowing the air through the thing to play the note. She had no musical training, so somebody was saying, "Farewell to Nova Scotia," and could she do that later on? With the melodeon, she only used this thing for a very short time, on Devil's Island and out that way. But it became this iconic symbol of her work. She later just uses tape recorders as soon as electricity is more prominent in rural areas.
I think, people, I was going to say sometimes forget, and I don't think that's right. I think it's just a question of not being aware. Like, because of our technology, we can look anything up now on Google, and we can communicate, FaceTime or whatever it is that you're using. It's so easy for us. But in the older days, as they say, which are not actually that far away, oral traditions were the way that people communicated information and history and knowledge and stories. I don't think you can overstate the importance that Helen Creighton would have had to Nova Scotian history, to who we are today.
We're doing more trying to collect folklore and folk song. It's something it's in the DNA of this house, so we kind of have to, so we've committed to that. And why not? Helen was the First Lady of Folklore, Canada's First Lady of Folklore, she's been referred to. We have that Parks Canada plaque out front. That came to us in 2018 when she was designated a person of national historic interest. So, let's make hay while the sun shines, kind of thing.
Childhood is sort of, historically speaking, more of a recent phenomenon.
Doesn't seem to be a whole lot of play with those two.
And they're nice little matching dresses right out of a horror movie. I love it.
So here we are. I'm going to offer a few explanations first. First of all, we're masked up because we're in a room and we can't social distance, so not necessarily be like, So we're obeying all the protocols, keep everyone safe. You will occasionally see me move mine up. It'll slide down. And if my glasses fog up and I look like a supervillain from a Frank Miller film, well, that's sort of the least of our concerns in the COVID era, but it's
That's why I'm not wearing mine.
Oh, well, I could have done that, but then I can't see all the cool stuff. You know where all the cool stuff is.
Yeah, that's true. I don't need to see it.
So be like, look at this cool thing here. Be like Mr. Magoo. So this room is emblematic of what a parlor would have looked like in the Victorian era?
Yeah, so this is the double parlor, we call it. Over here we have our little explanation and photos for the James family, who actually built the house.
This just takes me back to a museum I was at last year where I was leaning on the case, and I don't speak French, but I saw something in French, and I said, I bet that says I shouldn't be leaning on the case. And the guy said, it's exactly what it says. So you always have to be careful around the furniture as I come through.
Yes, we try to keep the sturdiest furniture out, but
Right. So these are all very angry-looking people.
yes, as you would have looked in the Victorian era, photography, of course, back then you probably had to sit for 20 or 30 seconds.
Oh,
So
that's true.
kind of hard to keep a smile on.
Now it's like your cell phone, 28 pictures in
Yeah.
2 seconds. Back then, don't move, don't move, don't move. We got it.
They actually had little bars they would keep your head straight with.
Really?
Little clamps, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Like the kids, the whole thing in the Victorians, they all looked like they tried to make them look like adults, little adults.
Yeah, it very much was. Childhood is sort of, historically speaking, more of a recent
Yes.
phenomenon.
Doesn't seem to be a whole lot of play with those two. Who look very unhappy.
Yes, and they're nice little matching dresses right out of a horror movie. I love it.
Symmetry was a thing for the Victorians.
Yeah, so especially in this era, sort of the mid-Victorian era, mid-1800s, they were very interested in symmetry. They saw a lot of symmetry in nature, and so it was sort of a way to imitate nature and get closer to God almost.
Well, that makes sense
Yeah.
for the Victorian era. I don't think that makes sense for why my parents dressed my younger brother and I exactly alike, including in matching SO t-shirts, which I, to this day, it's like, are you kids working the pumps? No, I'm 9. I don't know why I have this on, but my brother's, he's got one too. He's working, he does the windshield. I pump the gas. You could look at the Victorian era and think, these people led really dour lives. And
Well, the stiff upper lip and
yes,
everything, you know?
yes. Where you would put, you were telling me, again, folks, I'm not as smart as I'm about to sound. Whoops, destroyed the pincushion. The men all, in the military in particular, would wear mustaches.
Yeah, so from the mid sort of 1800s to I think about 1916, it was actually compulsory for men in the British military to have a mustache, specifically because they thought it would make them look more intimidating to the enemy to have these big, lovely mustaches.
If you're that close to the enemy,
Yeah.
that they can see that you have a really big mustache, it's probably the bayonet that's going to look more intimidating to them. I mean, it's kind of like being a
Yeah.
hockey player. If you're playing the puck, you're in real trouble. So if you're playing the mustache, you're not going to see the bayonet coming in. So it's like, oh, wow, that's a scary mustache. And you get the knife right in the ribs.
Yeah. So what actually became popular at the time were mustache cups.
So I have a mustache. I
Yep.
sort of actually have a little one here. And it would be all dyed and stuff like, if you ever watch baseball, Raleigh Fingers, my generation, the handlebar mustache that they would have. And so you'd be like, oh, hello, yes. We're about to go and win this battle, but first a spot of tea. Ew, so it's very waxy for some reason. Oh, if only I had one of those mustache teacups. Dang it.
Yeah,
Dash
so
it
they
all.
were incredibly popular during that time.
I imagine.
But of course, once that compulsion or the compulsory order to have a mustache went out, probably World War I, trench warfare.
1916, World War I, trench warfare. Yeah, I got this mustache, and I think there's like a family of lice living in it now. I don't know why he's talking in my British soldiers now moved on to a Brooklyn accent. Yes, right, I've got some lice. Well, shave it off, man. But how will we scare the Hun?
Yeah.
Well, maybe the bayonet, you know? And so we're always back to that.
But yeah, so those went out of fashion after that passed, and they're actually quite rare to find now. So this is the one we have. It's actually German.
Oh, sorry about the Hun comment.
Beautiful pink color, and it says "Think of me" on the side there.
Yes, I'll think of you. I remember you from the trenches.
Yes.
You terrible, murderous Hun. The war's over. Oh, hello, old boy.
Yeah. So they're quite more rare to find now.
So this was a big thing.
Yeah,
like
tea, different kinds of tea. So this
very much a
little
social.
set here, yeah, it was very much a social activity. And supper, or their supper dinner back then, actually ended up being quite late. So it would be like 8 or 9 o'clock. So they wanted something to sort of fill in between lunch and the formal dinner.
Wow.
So that was where you sort of started the afternoon tea bits.
See, my wife is always making fun of me. Actually, so's my mom, because I eat late. I eat around 8 or 9 o'clock. Ha! I'm just traveling back in time as we Time Lords do. I'm just doing it the way they did it.
Yeah.
Nice. That's definitely information I'm going to throw in both of their faces
Yeah.
once I get home.
So the pattern on this is called Moss Rose. It was quite popular. This is not a fancy set. It would have been sort of basic, and then you could paint your own pattern on it if you wanted.
Oh, nice.
The preferred china would have been from France, but not many people, especially in Canada back then, could afford to bring that over.
Right.
This big bowl is actually a slop bowl.
Wait,
So
what now?
a slop bowl,
Like pig slop?
a tea slop.
Okay.
So they didn't have, the little Lipton tea bags and everything back then, so they had the big bricks of tea. And you would, so when they were throwing like the Boston Tea Party, it was bricks. It wasn't like
Oh, they weren't throwing
tea. No.
I never actually thought of that. I kind of assumed, I always thought they were throwing like bags of tea or something. But
Yeah, no, it was, they had them in like bricks, so you would scrape off a bit, put it in with the hot water,
Wow.
which you'd have probably bigger cups back then. This is also called a farmer's cup, because
Right.
I guess farmers needed more caffeine. So when you got to the bottom, you have the dregs and all the little tea in there, so you would pour that in there and then just get another cup.
I have this picture. I'm just mashing arrows up of like British soldiers from the 1890s at the Boston Tea Party throwing with their little mustache teacups and saying, yes, revolt against the empire, dropping little tea bags from our era into that's a terrible science fiction novel not waiting to happen. Are we talking dozens of songs, hundreds of songs? Do we know how many she sort of cataloged?
Over 4,000.
Over 4,000?
Yes, over the course of 40-some years.
So we're here in one of the other Helen Creighton rooms with Dylan. Thanks for having us in to do this segment, Dylan, which is going to be musical, my understanding is.
Yes.
So tell us a bit about you and what you do and what we're going to sort of be experiencing here today.
My name is Dylan Jewers. I am the founder and owner of Big Turnip Records, which is a folk and roots music label based out of here in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. I'm a board member of the Helen Creighton Folklore Society, and I've been operating out of here for going on 3 years now. I've been recording here, I've put on concerts here, and today we're going to have a little performance by Amy Lou Keeler, a dear friend of mine, actually the person who introduced me to Helen Creighton's music back maybe 10 years ago. There's been a lot of activity here. I've recorded whole albums, singles, all different types of folk music and world music.
So when you say Helen Creighton's music,
The recordings that she did of other people.
right?
Yeah.
So it's she didn't write the music, but she preserved it and found it and kept it.
Yeah.
And so it lives on. People reinterpret it in their own ways now for our modern era.
100%.
Yeah. How many songs do you know? I mean, I don't want to give you a trick question, but are we talking dozens of songs, hundreds of songs? Do we know how many she sort of cataloged?
Over 4,000.
Over 4,000?
Yes, over the course of 40-some years.
Holy cow.
Yeah, starting in 1928, and I believe she stopped around 1975.
So it's kind of like the Rolling Stones.
Yeah, it's a little more, I think it's a little more vast than that.
Yeah.
But yeah, between songs that she notated and songs that she recorded, yeah, it's over 4,000, and then it's over 5,000 actual audio recordings.
Wow. So that comes just from the Maritime provinces.
Strictly.
So that gives you an idea that while the populations were relatively small, still is even today, just the sort of differences of all the communities that were much more isolated back then
100%.
and how they could sort of develop their own songs that would be similar maybe in theme, but different in execution to the community down the road.
Correct. And the vast majority of her collection was done between Dartmouth and, say, like halfway up the eastern shore.
Okay.
That's the bulk of it. But she went South Shore, she went to the Valley, she went to Cape Breton, she went to Miramichi, southern New Brunswick, Grand Manan, and she went to a few places in Prince Edward Island. But that came later. The majority of it was actually in Nova Scotia.
Come, all ye fair and tender girls that flourish in your prime prime. Beware, beware if your garden's fair. Let no man steal your time, time. Let no man steal your time. And when your time it is past and gone, he'll care no more for you. And every place that your time was waste will spread all o'er with through, will spread all o'er with through. A woman is a branched tree, and man a singing wine, wine. And from her branches carelessly he takes what he can find, find. He takes what he can find. Come, all ye fair and tender girls that flourish in your prime, prime. Beware, beware if your garden's fair. Let no man steal your time, time. Let no man steal your time.
Hey, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I usually try and end every episode with a joke, usually making fun of myself. But I love history. That's why I studied it when I was younger. And anytime I hear folks sing these old songs that reach across the generations, the centuries even in many cases, it's almost like being, Doctor Who, like a Time Lord. Like that idea that you can travel back and hear through your voice and through those words interpreted today, imagining women singing that song decades ago, 100, 200 years ago.
Yeah.
And why they would have sung it and sort of the links between our generation and the generations that came before. It's a special gift that Helen Creighton left for us, because if she hadn't, a lot of it would have been lost.
Yeah.
So it's nice to be able to find a bit of it again here at the Dartmouth Heritage Museum.